Tonight, my colleague Richard Lole will be presenting on the interim targets. Richard is our transformation director. He became full-time in our team in December, which is great for us. Prior to that, he was working at DEFRA for 10 years as chief executive, and 5 years he was there as agriculture director for 5 years. But he's been working in climate change since 2014. So the talk will go on for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A after that. We have been running slightly over with these presentations, but we'll try and keep to time tonight. So I will hand over to Richard to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ali. Thanks for that, Alan. And could I just add my thanks to you all for joining tonight. I appreciate many of the names look like you've joined us all three, and really grateful for that. What I was going to try and do this evening is really give a quick overview of the interim target consultation. Or I would if I could get the slides to move on. It's always the way, isn't it? The very first one takes a while to get going. So in terms of objectives for today, I just want to start with a little bit of context of the consultation and the things around it, because there's quite a lot of relevant factors. So I'll talk about the implications of the legislation, the island plan, the imminent extension of the Paris Agreement, and some of the other changes in our situation that actually mean some of these developments we're expecting to happen are pretty well inevitable. So that's quite a useful piece of context. I wanted to look at some of the implications of the target if it's adopted, and then a little bit of a session on what's it mean for you, and trying to think about some of the concerns people have, and to explore some of those. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in questions and answers afterwards. And then I'll try and pull out some of the key points that I think I've made over the session. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll crack on. So first, thinking about the context of the consultation, the new Climate Change Act was enacted in December, and that actually introduces quite a series of early obligations. So the first one is that we have to have a climate change plan for the 5 years 2022 to 2027 in place by April. Importantly, we also have to introduce an interim target, and of course that's what this consultation is about. And the interim target pretty well sets the content of the 5-year plan, because if we're going to achieve a target level by 2030, we have to have it on track by 2027 at the end of this first 5-year plan. So the two are very much linked. We're also in the middle of preparing guidance for public bodies about their new statutory obligations under the Climate Change Act, and those will be published in April, with regulations to follow in June. And also there's climate change impact assessments, which put a duty on departments to take account of climate change impacts as part of their decision making, with regulations in December next year. For those of you that have seen the island plan, you'll have seen there is an awful lot about climate change in there, and pretty much putting it at the heart of government's thinking, which is probably the strongest commitment government has ever made, certainly in my time. And also a requirement to introduce a route map to get to net zero by 2050. So it's sort of the 5-year plan just talks about the 5 years. The interim target talks about the next 8 years, but to put a plan in place that indicates where the sorts of steps we will have to take along the way to get to 2050. And certainly I found it, as we've been working on it, that's been really helpful in terms of framing my thinking, and I hope that will be useful to the public in terms of understanding our thinking around it as well. And the other important one is the implications of joining the Paris Agreement. So the UK agreed in November that they were, having reviewed the approach we were taking, they were comfortable with extending the agreement to the Isle of Man, as well as the other 2 Crown dependencies. But as part of that, we have to introduce an ambitious target for reductions to be achieved by 2030. And of course, that goes hand in hand with what we're trying to do for the bill. And it also introduces a very strong reporting commitment to the UK. And we already report our figures, but they have been on a voluntary basis. And so we would expect them to be fully audited, etc., going forwards, and welcome that. Some other really important context to bring into account. One is the sort of energy and heating technology situation. We've already the previous administration made a commitment to banning fossil fuel house boilers in 2025, and that's contained in the new Act. The existing diesel generators are reaching the end of their life somewhere around 2028 and would either need very significant reinvestment or replacement at that point. The main gas turbines will need significant reinvestment by 2031 and have a design life that would expire sometime in the mid-2030s, which is why the O'Varrett report, who assessed our options, recommended decommissioning at that point rather than making a reinvestment. And so effectively, when we look at the energy generation, all of our existing equipment will need replacing during this same period. And what was pleasing was to see that the O'Varrett recommendations identified viable routes to do that, to replace it with renewable energy, actually for less than replacing it with conventional fossil fuels again. That's if we wanted to, or if we could, with an expectation that that kind of equipment could have lasted for another 30 years. So that's really important context, because we have to spend a fair bit of money anyway, and it's about doing something different. The other quite important piece that comes out there is the gas turbines currently use 80% of the gas that's used on the island. So when we get to that point in somewhere around 2030, when we stop using the gas turbines, it's likely the gas will be carrying more of the overhead cost of pumping and purchasing and all those other things. So there is a risk we see gas starting to increase. And I appreciate, we've just seen a market fluctuation, but that would be much more of a structural fluctuation upwards as more of the cost is borne by less gas coming through the system. So again, that nudges us towards the domestic and commercial property heating moving quicker. There's some other things that we're not alone in this. We all appreciate we're an island, but what the UK does and Ireland does has big significance to our options. So the UK have already announced that they're banning the sale of new fossil fuel powered cars in 2030 and hybrids by 2035. And that is currently our main market. So whether we wish to move or not, it's likely that we will find new fossil fuel cars are either more expensive or simply unobtainable by that point. And similarly, the UK are currently incentivising heat pumps, and we met with the minister at COP26, who said they were doing that for one reason alone, which was simply to stimulate the market, gain critical mass and get more contractors able to fit them, etc., with the expectation that that will reduce the installation price very quickly over the next few years. And the other point is the UK expects to introduce hydrogen from 2031, which currently our gas turbines couldn't cope with. So that change in other jurisdictions quite quickly has a ripple effect to us, which is outside of our control. So I guess that's one of the most important introductory points I wanted to make, which was change will happen regardless of our intentions. So we will see less of fossil fuel cars available on the market. We've already seen a massive change in the availability of EVs, electric vehicles. Fossil fuel boilers will become obsolete in the UK as they transition to heat pumps. So it's right that we plan for that obsolescence. We have obsolescence in the generation, and we have expectation of obsolescence in both cars and property heating. And it would actually, irrespective of climate change, those are things we need to take account of. Thinking about the interim targets, how do we compare? So Wales, Scotland have already achieved their 2020 targets, and Scotland's target was 56% by 2020. And whilst they don't have a definite confirmation, they are confident they've achieved that. If we look at the sorts of targets that some of the surrounding jurisdictions are looking for 2030, the UK is looking at 68%, Wales 63%, Scotland 75%. So on the one hand, 45% seems very daunting for us from where we are now, but on the other, compared to the level of progress that's being achieved elsewhere, it is a comparatively small step. The challenge is we're in some ways joining it slightly late in the game. And when we look at the targets that some of those jurisdictions have got going forwards, they really are very ambitious. Moving on from there and thinking about our emissions per head. And so this graph shows the countries of Europe and their emissions per head. So the emissions for each person in the jurisdiction. We're the bar at the left-hand side in red. So we are very much above average. Guernsey are the next bar in green. The next one after that is UK in green. And then over to the right is Jersey. But it's quite important to keep in context, Jersey imports all of its electricity. And so it is very much comparing eggs with cheese. Moving on from there and thinking about, we did a consultation last summer, and that was looking at various aspects of the plan and also tested out the level of ambition people had for an ambitious target. And whilst with hindsight, we probably asked too many different questions rather than a yes/no type approach, what we got was in the blue section. So this is a summary of the answers, and there was, I think, 319 people responded. Whether that's a significant representation, I'm not sure, but those were the people that had appetite to comment. The red section, sorry, the blue section at the top right said, work out the very fastest progress we can do and base your interim targets on that. And that effectively is what we're doing at 45%, if that's the target we pick. The red section, which is the other really big one, was actually people saying, yes, go for 45%. So that we had 30% saying go for the highest you can in blue, 25% saying go for 45%. And the green section, which is the other big one, said do the research, work out what you can, and align your target to that. So we actually had 77% of those responding saying go for the most ambitious target you can, and that is effectively what we're trying to do here. But we want people's views on whether they're up for that, because it affects all of us. And it's quite important when thinking about the implications of this to look at the source of our emissions. And I guess if you took nothing else from this evening's talk, I'd be really grateful if you would remember a couple of aspects on this slide, and it's the clues in the title. Electricity is key. Our largest single source of emissions, and this is 2019 data, is from electricity. So 212,000 tonnes out of our 700 are from the gas turbines. And that is by far the biggest single source. And it means, therefore, that we couldn't achieve a significant level of decarbonisation without addressing electricity. Because if we think about homes, which is the grey section at the left-hand side, 21% of our consumption is from heating, and the only way we can decarbonise that is by moving on to decarbonised electric. And similarly, when we look at the blue section at the top left, about half of the business emissions are from heating. So it's just imperative that we address the electricity emissions to actually be able to make progress. And the other thing I'd like to bring out from this, if I may, just looking at the transport section, which is the bottom right, which is the second biggest section, by far the biggest proportion of that is from cars. And I consciously bring that out because one of the things that came through quite strongly in the consultation over the summer was a real concern from many contributors that we might interfere with their right to have private travel, to use cars as they need them, because it's become very much central in many people's lives. And I think many of us would understand why there's a concern about that. But it does clarify that cars in themselves are 13% of our emissions. And if I could be slightly mischievous for a minute, if we look at the other end of that spectrum, buses are 4%, which is 0.5% of our total emissions. Sorry, buses are 4,000 tonnes, that's all, compared to 94,000 from cars. So again, to make real progress, we do have to find ways of reducing fossil fuel travel by car. And that's not the same as saying people can't have cars and can't do their own thing. which is why we'll spend a little bit of time talking about EVs later. So as we've talked about transport, we've talked about electricity, homes, I've to some extent talked about agriculture. That's probably, and across the world, when you look at agriculture, it is one of the more difficult areas in that climate change also challenges many areas' production ability to produce food. And so Europe, which is one of the few areas where climate change actually may help production, does have almost an obligation to make sure we're doing all we can to produce food. And our challenge is most of our land is only fit for livestock, and livestock are one of the biggest sources of methane. But that's an area where we'll need to work very carefully and to boost efficiency, to see what we can do to reduce methane, etc. And then we get to business, where it's fundamentally two things. It's heating or it's cooling is the majority of the consumption. And waste at the top there in green is 3%. And there are things we can do with waste, but nonetheless, they are only 3% of the total emissions. So it kind of, that donut chart, as I've started calling it, emphasises the three areas we really need to make rapid progress with, which is electricity, transport, and property heating and efficiency. So moving on from there, we compared earlier the different interim targets that different jurisdictions are putting in place. And so on this chart, we've got on the left the Isle of Man's combined emissions, and that's for the period 1990 through to 2019. And at the right-hand side, we've got the UK's greenhouse gas inventory, and you'll notice ours has tended to go up slightly over the years. It's been steady now for the last 15 years, but it hasn't been coming down, whereas the UK's has been steadily dropping since 1991. And the other thing that comes through, and this echoes what I've just talked about with energy generation, by far the biggest area of reduction in the UK's emissions is in that, I should have looked up what the colour's called, I'm going to say turquoise, but that green second colour up. And as you look across it, you can see how much their electricity generation emissions have reduced during the period. They're 30% of what they were at the start of that period. And the other one is less clear, but transport has also reduced in the UK. And that same gradual reduction in transport emissions shows in the Isle of Man, which is simply improved efficiency of cars as global regulation and European regulation has required reduced emissions. But that level of progress wouldn't be fast enough for what we're trying to do now. So that sort of some bits of context I wanted to give to help us think about the targets. And I now want to move on to a discussion about the sorts of things we've been talking about. And it's really important as we, now this next slide I'm going to show, I don't expect you to be able to read, and I will look at it in more detail at the moment. It's just to remind you that in the current consultation, this chart is in there and it laid out indicative journeys of how we could do it. And there's a couple of things I wanted to bring out of this. The first point was, in modelling this, we looked at four options. We looked at 25%, 35, 45, and the equivalent of 68%, which is the UK's target. And we quite quickly realised that there wasn't a realistic or feasible way we could achieve 68% by 2030 without simply relying on offsets. And the Climate Change Act commits that we will not look at global offsets. We have to achieve our own emissions reductions. And we also realised that 25%, given that we can't achieve a great deal without decarbonising electricity, we can exceed 25% relatively straightforwardly, because that comes from the reduction in electricity generation emissions. So that's why we narrowed it down to 35 and 45. And the one thing this, I hope you count is, which is the second box down, to get to 45, there isn't a great deal extra we would need to do. And similarly at the bottom, the green section, food and land use, there isn't a lot extra we could do. So the real change between 35% and 45% comes from the pace of change we'd have to make on our heating actions and our transport actions. And I'm hoping that if I now click forward to the next stage, you can start to see the contents of that table. So so I've got the 35% boxes here. And I repeat the comment about indicative. This is not saying exactly what we need to do, but it's saying this is a valid journey, and we have some really big decisions to conclude in terms of our energy strategy. But there is already a clear acceptance that we need to fully decarbonise our electricity generation, and that we will need a second or possibly even two more interconnectors to make sure that we have the balancing capacity as well as the resilience to look to a very much increased consumption of renewable energy. We would have to look at local, brand new local generation as well. But as we talked about earlier, that bit is inevitable because all of our local generation is coming to the end of its life. There's quite an important point of accepting that actually, whilst government would expect to invest in the key infrastructure, some of the generation, certainly wind and solar, could happen at home, could happen at a community level, could happen at a commercial level, either onshore or offshore. And there are lots of people interested, lots of businesses interested in doing that. The other option, the other opportunity that's coming through quite strongly is actually the UK's desire to get more renewable energy means we probably have an opportunity to have significantly more offshore wind than we need for our own consumption, and to conceivably be selling that commercially into the UK. I think that would be a commercial venture rather than Isle of Man government venture, but nonetheless that would help fund the transition, as well as becoming another source of renewable energy for the island. So in some ways, in terms of technology, I mean, it's flipping complicated, but that bit is, we wouldn't be doing anything that hasn't already been done in many other places. And so it's reasonably reliable process. It's quite daunting to try and do it by 2030, but it is reasonably straightforward. You can tell I'm not an engineer. In terms of heating, we've already acknowledged that we're aiming to stop the sale or the installation of new fossil fuel heating in new builds by 2025, and that's in the legislation that's gone through Parliament. We'd have to make sure to get to 35% that replacement boilers increasingly use low carbon technology. So it doesn't have to be tremendous progress, but nonetheless, we'd need to achieve that. And for those of you that joined the presentation on the renewable heating scenarios work, one of the opportunities, and it is a very big opportunity in terms of much cheaper and more effective and low emission heating, is heat networks, district networks or community heating. And we would, there is, I think the work identified there was about a dozen places on the island where there is a critical mass and local heat sources that would probably allow that work to happen. So there was an expectation we'd at least trial and test that out, because that really does involve community engagement and wanting to do it. So our hope would be to achieve that. This is looking at 5% of total emission reductions coming from heating action. So that's about 25% of the heating emissions being reduced in this period. So we have somewhere around 20-25% of properties on renewable heating of one form or another, and that could be wood chip boilers on larger properties, that could be heat pumps on actually far more properties than people realise. And the other point there is the property efficiency, doing the fabric first. Would become a part of normal life, and the Green Living Grant Scheme was consciously launched first to try and encourage and incentivise and get a momentum around that. And so if we looked at those two sectors again and thought about what we'd have to do if we were going to increase it to 45%, and apologies I clicked twice there, with energy we don't need to do anything else. We've pretty well done what we can with energy on that basis. Heating, and I have, this is where the real individual decision making, how people respond to this consultation, comes in, because we would have to do much more progress with the way we heat homes, because this has gone from 5% to 11%. So we're more than doubling the emissions reduction from heating that we'd be trying to achieve, and that would involve a much greater level of homes moving to heat pumps. or hybrid heat pumps. I'm not going to try and talk about the detail of that because it was discussed the other night, and people could, if people want to talk about it, we can talk about it at the end. But and similarly, heat networks, we would have to try and find a way of rolling quite a large volume of those out, subject to the feasibility studies working and confirming that's possible. And we'd be trying to achieve effectively around half of properties switching to electric heating, and I think people then typically look at that and say, well, you know, when you look at the number of boilers per week, that's quite a lot. Is that really achievable? But actually, in terms of the volume of boilers that will be replaced over the next 10 years, a typical boiler life, I'm told, is somewhere between 12 to 17 years. So within the next 20 years, most boilers will be replaced. And I appreciate many of us will have old oil burners, and they do seem to have a longer life, but they are a lot of the old ones are very inefficient, which means swapping them would be better. The other point, and again, it's worth, I really want to be clear about it. I think we would have to move to much more expectation and requirement of energy performance certificates. So one of the obvious ways of doing that is when a house is sold or when it's let to so the occupancy of the property changes, there would be a requirement to have an EPC at that point. And many of you will be aware some other jurisdictions have had that for some time. And it is noticeable that the UK's average property is one grade higher, more efficient than ours. And I've got to be honest and say I used to regard those as a bit of a pain, and I didn't understand the value in them. But what it's intended to do is mean that when somebody is looking to buy or to rent a property, they can understand how much work has been done and how much more work would need doing. So for the tenant, they know how expensive the heating bill is going to be. And for the owner, they understand whether they are buying something that's had all the efficiency done or still got to do it. And so it's consciously intended to capitalise the value so that the market will pay more to rent or pay more to buy something that's already had the money spent on it. So then moving on to the other two sectors, with transport, to achieve that, we're trying to get a 3% reduction, 3% of the overall reduction coming from transport. We think that would need about 20% of the island's suitable vehicles to be electric by 2030, which is probably somewhere around 10,000 vehicles. We've got almost 1,000 already, and the rate is definitely accelerating. So I think that is achievable on current trends. We really have to match the UK's new petrol and diesel car registration by 2030. We're assuming that there will be an improved uptake of active travel and public transport, and that's one of the areas again where this is around community appetite, because there is, in many areas, and I appreciate not all areas, there is already quite a good bus service. The occupancy levels are going up. We as individuals face lots of choices in how we travel, and this is very much about personal choice. There would have to be continued expansion of electric vehicle charging network, because especially for those who can't charge at home, they need to be reassured that they can easily get onto a public charger to keep an electric vehicle charged. I think the other one that's really important is increasing number of people working from home where their role allows, because that's especially suitable where people have comparatively longer journeys, where it saves them time, it saves them money, and it saves emissions overall. So that's an area which actually is sort of a win from every perspective. The food and land use actions, which is a mixture of agriculture and food and sequestration. We talked earlier about adjustments in terms of livestock management, managing slurry better, changing some of the nutrition, improving efficiency. All of those things can reduce methane emissions quite noticeably. Tree planting and peatland restoration and wetlands and things of that nature are really important early on, and people don't always see the linkage in that. What we're trying to do is increase the carbon removals. And the earlier we do that, the more established they become, and so they grow over time, so that by the time we get to 2050, they're really making a big contribution, because there will clearly be areas where we can't reduce them. And my apologies if everybody knows that. but it's certainly something that took me a while to realise why it was so important to get going on that early on. And that's why we have already been working on that. And the other one in that area is improving local and global food supply chain, reducing waste. And quite importantly, in the home, about 30% of food is wasted through the supply chain and in the home. And when you think about the proportion of emissions, if you put the emissions from food all together, they are massive, between transport, between production, etc. So there's a real opportunity to make a reduction there. So that's the 35%. But when we start talking about then trying to take that up to 45%, actually there isn't a great deal more we could do during the period in terms of food and land use, which means it comes down to transport thereafter. So we need to do everything that we were talking about doing on the 35%, plus trying to really get the majority, half of Ireland's main travelling undertaken in EVs, and I've consciously put travelling in asterisks, because we have about 65,000 cars, but an awful lot of them really don't do very much mileage. And so we think that most of the travelling is done in a much smaller volume of cars. So if we could achieve 20,000 EVs, that's probably more than half the mileage, because it tends to be a lot of mileage in the people's better car if people have two cars. And I appreciate there's a lot of sweeping statements in there, but on average that seems to be the case. We would also need, we think, to look at consideration restrictions on sale of older and high emission vehicles, and to actually start bringing that and the new vehicle purchase ban forwards a bit to really help take those emissions off and to switch more onto EVs through that period. We need to make faster progress around active travel and the low emission public transport uptake. So we need, it speeds up the charging network, it speeds up the switch to low emission public transport, it speeds up the switch to looking at how we make our urban areas car free, or certainly high emission vehicle free, and the pace of change in the way we live our lives starts to accelerate a bit. And it's really important for me to say those are not the plan. They are a set of scenarios that would work to achieve it. We've got the energy scenario, future energy scenario, and we now need to actually turn around and say, so that narrows it down a lot. It's clear we have several options. They're feasible, they're viable, they're affordable, and they will deliver the energy we need. We need to agree which one we're doing, and we need to get on with it. But in any of them, we'll need another interconnector, and the feasibility study has already started on that. So moving on from there, I just wanted then to think about what does it mean for you, because that's quite a bit of change in the period. But I'm not sure it actually really means we're dramatically changing our lives, nor are we significantly having a financial impact. And I told you the idea of calling this myth busting, or whatever we want to call it. So the first one is, I used to think electric cost would go up if we stopped using gas. We currently have a very reliable, very actually simple system that reliably produces electricity at a steady level, and it has, and this is not a technical word, but it has great on and off ability. So they can cope with a variation in demand, whereas we're looking to much more complex situations from that point of view. But actually, we can do most of that through the interconnector to give us the stability and the balancing. However, we have to replace all of our generators within the next 10 years anyway. And as I've said several times, we believe that the investments required to put in renewable can be cheaper, and two of the options from memory were cheaper than replacing what we've already got. They are realistic. OVAR are a very reputable firm and do an awful lot of modelling work for governments and businesses in terms of understanding what could be done. And their calculations show that the combined energy costs would not increase to the consumer. So when we think about switching to EVs, we think about switching to electric heating. Electricity bills for those that have done that will go up, but that's because they won't be spending money on garage forecourt, and they won't be spending money with one of the local oil or gas suppliers. So the actual cost per unit of energy shouldn't go up over this. Government has clarified in that consultation that they expect us to fund the core infrastructure, and that that's affordable through the normal electricity costs, but that we think private commercial operators will almost certainly want to invest in offshore and on-island generation, as many individuals will as well. So we don't think that actually electricity costs will go up materially as a result of that, though electricity bills for those who have swapped may do, but their overall combined energy bill will go down. All things being equal, and look at what's just happened with gas, so all projections are dodgy, aren't they? Then thinking about electric cars, and it's interesting with both electric cars and electric heating systems, there's a lot of focus on the... Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Awesome, thank goodness for that. I've moved on to my phone's hotspot. I don't know what's going on with the modem, so my apologies for that. Now, I'm not going to try and share the slide. It'd be better if I can. Let's just see if I can share the slides, because I think it's helpful. So hopefully you've got the slides again. Is that sharing okay?
We can still see the slides from the previous presentation,
Oh, right.
So it's still on electric cars.
Okay, that's probably not going to let me change it then, is it? However, so typical cost, somewhere around, well, I actually worked this out on our car. I literally went out and took a photo of what the average consumption was, and it's a long-term damp thing. That's costing us 4.6p a mile. If we had an off-peak charging system, it'd be 2.5p. Current road tax 0. So for us doing 8,000 miles a year, it's about £1,000 a year saving compared to a similar sized petrol car. I know a big issue is range anxiety. We're a small island, however, but there are now already 50 public chargers, and there are more ready to install. And it's interesting to note that in the UK, their sales really have taken off now, with 1 in 4 new cars sold in December in the UK were EVs. Now, their overall sales were down, and that might be a slightly disproportionate figure. However, that is what was sold in December in the UK, and it's quite important because a lot of that's driven by UK car tax, company car purchases now, which means they will come onto the market in 2 to 3 years. So the supply of second-hand electric vehicles is going to escalate really quite quickly. And the other thing that's coming from that is, as they've been around longer, the battery life is proving better than many thought, and therefore depreciation is now similar to conventional cars and improving. So I think all the trade press is now confident that total cost of ownership of an electric car is now lower than conventional cars, but I appreciate they cost more to buy. Now, I'm not at all sure whether the slide is going to move on when I move it at this end, but let's give it a go. So I don't know whether your slide has moved on at that point.
So it says, what does this mean for me? I used to think electric heat pumps cost too much.
Good. Okay, so it is moving. Thank you. Isn't technology fantastic? So again, electric heat pumps are materially more expensive to buy. If an average boiler change is somewhere 3,000 to 5,000, an average heat pump change or initial installation is somewhere 10 to 15,000. I think the average currently is about 12 on the island. And that's come out of some work that the MUA have done, where they've been offering a trial system where they've given a loan to help with the purchase and simply allowed the loan to be paid off over a number of years as part of the electricity bill. We also used to believe that you almost had to have a absolutely sealed box of a house with fantastic insulation all around you, and it's absolutely clear that's not the case. And providing there is reasonable insulation and a relatively low draft house, most medium-sized houses are being heated elsewhere with electric heat pumps successfully, and our climate is relatively mild. The other thing is, I know there's a lot of concerns around electricity costs more and they must therefore cost more to operate. And I'll come back to part of that in a minute. But with the electricity people are putting into a heat pump is mainly to do the pumping around of the heat and the working of the heat pump itself. The energy for heating comes either from the air or the ground, and that's that bit comes free. And so this is a report. The OFT do an annual report comparing domestic heat costs. So this is the 2020 report. And at the left-hand side, I've circled a heat pump, a normal gas tariff, an average size heating oil situation. At the bottom, a typical wood chip heating system on the island. And at the right-hand side, the last column is the cost per unit of effective kilowatt. And so heat pumps come out at 3.6 pence per kilowatt. And if you look to the column next to it, that's because it's 400% efficient. In other words, you're pumping the energy round, but the heating energy is coming from the atmosphere. And I think there's a relatively low appreciation around that, though I appreciate tonight I'm probably talking to the converted already, so my apologies for that. What also I think there's a relatively low understanding of is if we look at the next line down, which is gas. Gas is 9.1 pence per kilowatt to heat the average home, which is 2.5 times more expensive. Heating oil at 4.5, it's 25% more expensive. So the business case against heating oil is harder. But on gas, the business case works out really quite well. Wood chip is the second cheapest option. And that's why for some bigger properties, that sort of biofuels or wood chip may well be a viable solution. And so to go back to that sort of summary of heat pumps, they are cheaper to operate than oil, and especially the gas. As I said earlier, over 60 have now been fitted across the island that we're aware of. There's a lot more than that in real terms, but there seems to have been very good feedback from the work that the MUA have done. And the Scandinavians have used them for years. Now, I better keep moving, so I'll just summarise the key points of what I've tried to get across tonight. Without reducing our electricity, we can't make the emissions from our electricity. We can't make real progress. So that's an absolute core, that large orange segment in the graph on the right. The report gave credible, robust and affordable options for us to change to decarbonised electricity. The cheapest and quickest route to make that change, and if we're going to do this by 2030, we do have to be quick, because if you think about large capital projects in 8 years, that's quite some achievement. So that's why the work has already started on a feasibility study around new interconnectors, because we will need that to balance intermittence. On island, generation is really important because it increases security of supply, especially when UK are short of renewable energy, because what we're not trying to do is export our emissions. We're trying to make sure we're buying renewable energy. Then with decarbonised energy, we can switch heating and cars to electric, and that then brings in the next two big segments in that graph on the right. EVs have now got a lower total cost of ownership, sales are increasing, second-hand market is growing, so they are becoming much more accessible. Electric heat pumps are reliable and cheap to run, and their price is expected to come down. And so compared to gas, actually it's probably almost, it is already cost effective. Oil is more challenging. And the other real point I was trying to make was, throughout the talk, to achieve a 45% reduction, we have to make much faster progress on heating and transport. That's the real area of difference. So just to remind you, if I may, the consultation closes on the 21st of February. It can be found on the Government Consultation Hub. And the feedback that comes from the consultation will directly influence the first Climate Change Action Plan, which we expect to publish in March. So that's the reason why the consultation is relatively short, because we need to take account of it, and we need to move into that data, move into getting that plan out the door. So apologies for the technology issue in the middle. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll maybe move to some of the questions.
Thank you, Rich.